The register was open on the table beside the vicar, and Cecily Vane pressed the pen to the page and signed her name for the last time. She had planned this moment for 26 months. She had imagined it in the narrow lodging in Cheapside, in the cold mornings before her pupils arrived, in the sleepless hours after her father's funeral, when she had sat beside the covered glass and counted what she had left, and found it amounted to very little, except this. The possibility of this. The one path that led through the man responsible for what had been done to her family, and came out the other side into something resembling justice. She had not imagined the warmth of the church. She had not imagined the watery November light through the east window falling across the register in a way that made her new name look, for a moment, as though it had always been there. She had not imagined Edmund Ashwell standing precisely 6 inches to her left, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile as composed as carved stone, while the vicar said the words that bound them. She had not imagined feeling, in the moment the pen left the page, something other than satisfaction. The Earl of Stancroft turned to look at her. His eyes were gray, almost colorless in this light, and they moved across her face with the same measured efficiency she had already learned to associate with him in their 3 brief meetings prior to this morning. He was reading her, she understood, filing what he found. She met his gaze and did not look away. "Lady Stancroft," he said quietly, as though testing the title against her. She said nothing. She inclined her head precisely 1 degree and turned back to accept her gloves from her maid. She had not come here for a marriage. She had come here for a name that would open the doors of Stancroft Hall and the records it contained, and the man who stood now beside her, the man she intended to undo. 2 years and 2 months earlier, she had stood in a different room while a different man spoke words over her father that could not be undone either. The churchyard at St. Giles had been frozen that February, the ground hard beneath the mourning party's boots, and there had been no one else present at Walter Vane's burial, except Cecily, her aunt, and the sexton. The man responsible for her father's death had not come. He never came. Men like Edmund Ashwell, the Earl of Stancroft, did not attend the funerals of the people their ambitions had destroyed. They sent no flowers and made no acknowledgement. They continued attending their clubs and their dinners and their parliamentary sessions, and they allowed the machinery of consequence to grind on without them, as though the grinding were a natural feature of the world and not the direct result of a choice they had made in a solicitor's office 4 years prior. Her father had been a man of business, clever, principled, and trusted by the man he served. Nathaniel Ashwell, Edmund's elder cousin, the rightful heir to Stancroft, had employed Walter Vane for 11 years and had trusted him with every financial matter the estate possessed. Nathaniel had been improvident in small ways, but not in large ones. His debts in France had been manageable. They had been, in fact, very nearly discharged. There had been a letter of credit arranged, a banker in Paris engaged, a sum transferred from the English estate through the proper channels. Walter Vane had arranged every piece of it. And then something had gone wrong. The credit had never arrived. Nathaniel had been taken for the debt. He had died in a debtor's prison outside Paris in the autumn of that year, and within 3 months, Edmund Ashwell, the cousin, the second son of a second son, the man no one had expected to inherit anything, had taken possession of the earldom. Walter Vane had known. He had traced the path of that letter of credit and found it terminated at a desk in Stancroft Hall, in a document Edmund had signed transferring the debt. He had tried to say so. He had written to the appropriate parties, presented what evidence he could assemble, and been met by the consolidated machinery of the Ashwell solicitors, the Ashwell connections, and Lady Portia Ashwell herself, Edmund's aunt by his uncle's first marriage, widowed now, installed at Stancroft as its social authority, and absolutely determined that no man of business from Southwark would undo what had been so carefully arranged. They had not needed to ruin Walter Vane overtly. They had only needed to wait. His reputation for reliability had been his only asset. When it was quietly understood in certain circles that Mr. Vane's evidence was the product of grief and loyalty to a dead employer rather than any credible documentation, his clients had withdrawn. It had taken 18 months. He had not lived to see the 22nd. Cecily had been present for all of it. She had watched her father diminish. She had taken in pupils to keep them fed. She had read every document he had assembled and committed to memory the name on the transfer, Edmund James Ashwell. She had the packet of her father's papers in a leather case in the trunk, now loaded onto the Stancroft carriage. She had the transfer document, copied in her father's hand. And she had the sealed letter, the last one, addressed in her father's writing in the final days of his illness, her name on the outside, never opened. She had carried it for 18 months without breaking the seal. She was not sure why. Perhaps because opening it would mean he was truly finished. Perhaps because she was afraid of what it said. She had told herself she would open it when the work was done. She stepped into the Stancroft carriage and did not look back at the church. Stancroft Hall stood in the Hertfordshire countryside 4 hours from London, and Cecily spent those 4 hours watching the winter fields pass the carriage window and making herself remember what she was here to do. If you have followed her this far, you may already sense the shape of the trap she had walked into. Stay with it. The house was large, Georgian, and beautiful in the way that houses which have been tended with efficiency rather than love are sometimes beautiful. The windows gleaming, the grounds maintained to a precise standard, the front entrance flanked by stone that had been recently repointed. Edmund Stewart, a thin, capable man named Graves, met the carriage and directed the unloading of their luggage with the same precision his employer applied to everything. Lady Portia Ashwell met them in the entrance hall. She was a handsome woman of 55, elegantly dressed, with silver hair arranged to communicate authority rather than age. She looked at Cecily for a moment, with the particular quality of attention that women of authority apply to things that require assessment. And then she smiled. "Lady Stancroft," she said. "What a very sensible arrangement." She paused. "Edmund has always been practical." Cecily understood the sentence. She was not the bride Portia would have chosen. She was not the bride anyone in this house would have chosen. She was neat, well-spoken, well enough featured, and entirely without connections. A solicitor's orphan, as Portia would phrase it that same evening in a letter to her particular friend in London, a young woman of no particular advantage whom Edmund had selected because she would cause no complications, no family to negotiate, no expectations to manage, no one to ask inconvenient questions about the succession. Cecily received the appraisal and returned it. She smiled, dipped a small courtesy, and said that she was glad to find Stancroft so well managed, and that she hoped not to disrupt any arrangement that had proven effective. Portia's eyes moved across her face with a sharpness she had not troubled to conceal, and then the smile returned, fuller now. "I believe you will find your place here easily enough," she said. She intended to. Her rooms were on the east wing, overlooking the kitchen gardens, not the most prestigious placement in the house, which had not escaped her notice. She spent her first 3 days at Stancroft orienting herself. She walked every corridor she was permitted to enter. She catalogued what she could see of the estate's organization. She located the room that served as the estate's archive, a locked study adjacent to the steward's office, and identified the 2 occasions daily when Graves was absent from his desk. Edmund she saw at dinner, at breakfast occasionally. He was not unkind. He was not, in fact, anything in particular. He was simply contained in the way of a man who had long ago concluded that most conversations were not worth the expenditure of self they required. He asked after her comfort, listened to her answers, and then returned to whatever was occupying his attention at the table's head. He did not appear to notice that she was watching him. She had grown up watching people whose words did not match their bodies. Her father had taught her that. She watched Edmund Ashwell across the dinner table and found, over those first weeks, an odd consistency. What he said was precisely what he meant, no more and no less. He did not flatter, did not dissemble, and did not perform warmth he did not feel. There was something almost restful about this, which she recognized as dangerous and reminded herself to disregard. On the 12th day at Stancroft, Portia found her in the morning room and sat across from her with the careful posture of a woman who had come to offer something she expected to cost her nothing. "I wonder," Portia said, "whether you might find a small consideration useful. I have asked Graves to prepare a quarterly sum for any domestic expenses you find necessary. A woman in your position, without family resources, I mean, must find the transition expensive." She produced an envelope, sealed, and set it on the table between them. Cecily looked at the envelope for a moment. "How generous," she said. "I must decline." Portia's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. "It is only practical," she said. "As is my refusal," Cecily said pleasantly. "I am the Countess of Stancroft, my lady. I would not wish Edmund to think I had accepted a private arrangement of which he was unaware." She returned the envelope across the table, untouched. She did not know, in that moment, that Edmund had been in the corridor. She would not know it for another week. What she noticed instead, beginning the following morning, was a small alteration in the household's quality of attention toward her. The footman who had been slow to respond began to respond quickly. The housekeeper, who had addressed her as "my lady," with the particular inflection of a woman honoring a formality she did not entirely credit, began to address her differently, with a warmth that was not theatrical. Edmund himself said nothing. He had never been a man who explained himself. He came to breakfast the following morning, looked at her across the table for a moment in the way he had of filing what he found, and asked whether she had seen the ice on the home farm pond, and whether she intended to walk out that afternoon. She said she had considered it. He said that the south path was clearest at this hour. Then he returned to his letters, and she returned to her tea, and neither said anything further about it. That was all. It was more than she had expected. The weeks that followed had a rhythm Cecily had not anticipated. Stancroft was a working estate, and its working concerned Edmund absolutely. She had expected a man of his position to spend his mornings at leisure. She had expected, frankly, a man who resembled what her imagining of him had assembled from her father's records and her own fury. She had not expected a man who rose before 6 to walk the home farm with his steward, who understood every line of his estate ledgers, who spent his evenings not at cards or claret, but at a desk covered in correspondence. She had also not expected the children. Edmund's ward, the son of his elder cousin Nathaniel, a boy of 8 named Thomas, left in Edmund's guardianship since Nathaniel's death, lived in the nursery wing with a nurse, and took his lessons in a room above the library. Cecily encountered him on the 3rd week when he appeared at breakfast without announcement and sat down across from her and looked at her with his father's eyes. She knew they were his father's eyes because her father had described Nathaniel Ashwell's eyes in 3 separate letters, warm brown, with a slight tilt at the corner, the kind of eyes that made people trust their owner without knowing why. "You are the new countess," Thomas said. "I am," she said. He considered her. "My uncle says you are very sensible." She found she could not quite manage a response to this. Thomas became, in the weeks that followed, one of two genuinely unexpected complications in Cecily's plan. He was affectionate and perceptive in the way of children who have learned to read adults carefully, and he attached himself to her with a lack of strategy that she found disarming. He came to find her in the mornings when his lessons were done. He showed her the folly at the south end of the grounds, and the hollow oak his father had told him about, and the particular view from the east staircase landing that Cecily, he reported with authority, probably had not found yet. She had not. Edmund was the other complication, though he would not have recognized himself as one. He stopped at the library door one Tuesday morning and looked at her as though he had not been planning to stop. She had a book open on the table and was reading with the particular quality of attention that most people recognized as privacy, and he did not disturb it. He simply stood for a moment in the doorway, and when she looked up and found him there, he said, "The library is at your disposal," which she was already aware of, and which she suspected was not what he had intended to say. Then he left. She stayed at the table for some time after, looking at the page she was no longer reading. Her pulse had done something specific when she looked up and found him there, something she had noted and filed and absolutely refused to examine. He had the quality, she was discovering, of a man whose attention, when it arrived completely. Most men of his station had learned to distribute their regard in fractions, a portion for each obligation. Edmund gave all of what he had, or none of it, and what he had was considerable. And standing in the doorway of the library, he had given it. Briefly, to her. And she had felt it the way one feels a door opened in a warm room onto cold air. On the Thursday following, he walked with her in the kitchen garden without having proposed to do so. They were both simply there. He told her the names of 3 of the apple varieties against the south wall with a specificity that suggested he had planted them himself, which she learned afterward from Graves that he had. The dismissive label arrived on a Tuesday, at a dinner that Portia had arranged, and Cecily had not been informed of in sufficient time to prepare. Miss Rosamond Holt was 24, very handsome, and entirely aware of the exact degree to which she had been displaced from an expectation she had considered settled. She arrived with her mother and occupied the chair to Edmund's right with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed the placement. She was kind to Cecily in the precise way of a woman performing graciousness for an audience. At one point, addressing a remark to her mother that was plainly intended to carry, she said, "The Countess is not quite what the season had anticipated, though I suppose Edmund has never been governed by the season's opinions, and the solicitor's orphan suits him in practical ways, one imagines." The table was not quite quiet enough for the phrase not to carry. Edmund, at the table's head, did not react visibly. His hand at his wineglass did not move. Cecily, who was watching, saw the slight tightening of the jaw she had learned to read in the past 6 weeks, and saw him look at Rosamond once, briefly, with the kind of precision that precluded any follow-up. Rosamond did not venture another remark of that kind. It was not, Cecily told herself, that this protection meant anything. He had a reputation to maintain, and a wife who was openly snubbed at his own table was an untidiness. That was all it was. She catalogued it and moved on. She had by this point located, copied, and memorized the transfer document. The estate archive had yielded it in the second week, 4 pages, dry and precise in the way of legal instruments, recording the assignment of a debt instrument from one creditor to another, signed in Edmund Ashwell's name in the spring of the year before Nathaniel had died. The significance was not obvious to an uninformed reader. To Cecily, who had spent 2 years studying her father's notes, it was everything. She had written to Mr. Greer, her father's former associate, who had agreed to attend the winter assembly at Stancroft in a professional capacity. She had the document. She had the testimony he could provide from Walter Vane's investigation. She had considered, in careful detail, the shape of what she intended to do with it. What she had not factored into the plan was the morning she came around the corner of the stillroom corridor and found Thomas standing in front of Portia, who was speaking to him in a low and level voice about the appropriate relationship between a ward and a countess who was, Portia was explaining, a temporary figure in the household whose influence over his habits and his affections was not something his guardian had encouraged. Thomas's face was the face of a child who did not yet know how to close himself off and was discovering, right now, that he would need to learn. Cecily walked past the corner. She stopped. She came back. She said, with a pleasantness she had learned from Portia herself, "Thomas, I believe your nurse is looking for you." "The yellow sitting room?" Thomas looked at her with a relief he was trying to conceal and left. Cecily met Portia's gaze and kept hers entirely level and said, "In future, my lady, conversations about the Countess's influence in this house are perhaps best conducted with the Countess directly." Portia's chin rose. "You are very assured," she said, "for a solicitor's orphan." She said it quietly, as an aside, as though it were a simple category rather than an act. "Yes," Cecily said. "I expect I am." What she did not know, standing in that corridor, was that Edmund had come around the other corner, that he had stopped and listened for the final exchange, that he had watched her walk away. She did not know any of this until the evening, when he came to the library where she had retreated to think, and stood in the doorway in the way he had taken to doing, and said, "Portia overreaches. I am aware of it." She looked at him. He was difficult to read past a certain point, like text in a language she had learned enough of to follow the argument, but not enough to hear the feeling underneath. "You need not manage her on my behalf," she said. "I am not managing her on your behalf," he said. "I am managing her because Stancroft is my house, and Thomas is my ward, and I decide what is said to him about the household." A pause opened between them that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply present, like weather. "He misses his father," Edmund said, then stopped. His hand moved to the doorframe and rested there. "I am not. I did not expect to be suited to it. The guardianship." Another pause. "He appears to have decided you are trustworthy." "I hope his faith is warranted," she said. She could not look at him when she said it. She looked at the shelf behind his shoulder instead, and felt the particular guilt of a woman who knows that what she has said is technically true and practically treacherous. "This," she told herself, "is why you should not linger. Do what you came to do, and go. If you are still with Cecily, and I believe you are, you will feel what she was refusing to feel by now." The tension she had constructed, so careful and so absolute, had begun to develop small, involuntary fissures, and she could not quite account for them. She pressed on. She met Mr. Greer at the winter assembly and arranged, in 3 minutes of quiet conversation in the assembly room's east corridor, the moment at which she would present the document and his testimony to the appropriate witness. She had identified a senior magistrate among Portia's invited guests, a man of her father's acquaintance, who owed Walter Vane a debt of professional gratitude and who would know what to do with what he received. 2 days before the assembly, she was in the East Wing corridor on her way to the room she still thought of as Graves's archive, when she heard Edmund's voice in the study beyond. Low, speaking to someone she did not immediately identify. She stopped. The voice that answered was Graves's, and what she heard stopped her more thoroughly than any calculation she had made in the previous weeks. Graves was reading from a document that Cecily recognized from its cadences as a legal instrument. He was reading from the very transfer she had copied and he was reading aloud the clause that identified the originating party. Edmund said, "Read it again." Graves read it again. "That is not my signature," Edmund said, in a voice so completely without inflection that Cecily's hand came up against the wall without her instruction to do so. "No, my lord," Graves said. "I believe it is not. The hand is similar. The name is correct. The seal is the estate seal, the one that was held in my uncle's study before his death." "Yes, my lord." Silence. A long silence, of the kind that has weight. "Portia managed my uncle's correspondence in the last 18 months of his life," Edmund said. "It was not quite a question. He was working through something." Cecily pressed her back against the wall and breathed. "She had access to his seal," Graves said. "She had access to everything," Edmund said. "I believe I need to speak with Mr. Greer." Cecily walked away down the corridor on legs that were not entirely reliable and went to her room and sat for a long time with her father's sealed letter in her hands. The assembly night arrived with a frost that gilded every surface of the Stancroft grounds. The rooms were full. Portia had organized the guest list with her usual precision, and the result was 200 members of the local ton arranged in a space that flattered the house and the hostess in equal measure. Cecily moved through it in the ivory gown she had brought from London, which was elegant without being ostentatious, and which she had selected months ago as appropriate to the event she had planned. She found, partway through the first set, that she could not locate Edmund in the room. She found Rosamond instead, standing near the fireplace with her mother, and heard, as she passed at precisely the wrong angle, what was being said to a woman she recognized as the local vicar's wife. "Poor creature," Rosamond's mother was saying, not quietly. "A solicitor's orphan installed at Stancroft. Portia is quite at her wits' end, I understand." Edmund was in such a peculiar state when he made the arrangement. He did not quite know what he was acquiring. Cecily kept walking. She crossed the room to the east corridor where she had arranged to meet Mr. Greer and found him waiting precisely as agreed, the relevant documents in a sealed case, his expression that of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is ready to put it down. He offered her the case, and then hesitated. "Miss Vane," he said, and corrected himself. "Lady Stancroft, I have been reconsidering. Your father came to me in the last months. You knew this?" He mentioned it. He had found something. Greer opened the case himself and showed her, alongside the papers she had expected, a second set of documents she had not. "This is the draft, the original transfer instrument before the fair copy was made. It is in a different hand from the signature. The signature on the fair copy is a forgery. I have had it examined by a specialist these past 3 months. The forger appears to have used as their model the Earl's signature from a different, legitimate document." He paused. Lady Portia Ashwell had access to both. Cecily sat with this for a moment. "What did my father say?" she asked, at the end. Greer was quiet. "He said he had been wrong about Edmund Ashwell. He said he had been so certain, and that certainty had cost him his judgment in the final years. He asked me to tell you, if the occasion presented itself, that the man you would find at Stancroft was not the man he had described to you." A pause. "And he left a letter for you, which I understand you have." She had the letter in her glove. She had transferred it there that morning without knowing why. She walked back through the assembly room, which had not stopped its noise and its movement, and climbed the stairs to the gallery above, and stood at the balustrade in the cold, with the unsealed letter in her hands, and opened it. It took 3 minutes to read. Walter Vane's handwriting had deteriorated in the last months of his illness. But he had been careful with this. He had taken care to be clear. He told her what Greer had told her, and more. He told her that the man responsible for Nathaniel Ashwell's death was not Edmund, whom he had come to believe had inherited in genuine ignorance of what had been done. He told her that his vendetta had consumed him and had narrowed him and had made him cruel in ways he had not intended, and that he was asking her, his daughter, who was cleverer than he had been and more precise, not to take on the weight he had carried and had set down only at the end. He told her he loved her. He told her Nathaniel would have told her the same. She read it through twice. She read it a third time, more slowly, because there was a passage near the middle where the handwriting failed entirely, and she had to work to recover the words. The candle she had lit in the gallery was burning low. Outside, the assembly continued below her, the faint thread of the orchestra reaching her through the floor. She had carried this letter for 18 months. She had refused to open it because she was afraid of what it said. And she had been right to be afraid. And the fear had protected her. And the protection had been entirely wrong. Her father was asking her forgiveness from the grave for a vendetta he had handed her as a gift, believing it was justice, believing she could carry it further than he had been able to carry it, not understanding that what she needed was not the weapon he had built, but the truth he had found too late to use. He told her to open her eyes. She stood at the gallery balustrade for a long time. Below, the assembly continued. She could see Portia near the fireplace, talking to the magistrate Cecily had identified weeks ago, talking to him with the particular quality of focus that meant she was managing something, preventing something, keeping something in place. Cecily put the letter in her glove and went downstairs. She did not go to the magistrate. She went to the small morning room adjacent to the assembly's main floor, and she sat down in the dark, and she waited. It took 20 minutes for Portia to come to her. Portia entered the room still carrying her smile, as though it were a garment she had simply forgotten to remove. She closed the door behind her with the precision of a woman who had prepared for this conversation, and was not afraid of it. "I wondered when we would come to this," she said. "The vicar's wife told me you were seen in the East Corridor. With Greer." "Yes," Cecily said. "Whatever he gave you," Portia said, "I would encourage you to consider carefully. A widow's limited influence over household accounts is not the same as the instrument your father believed he had found. Walter Vane was a competent man, but grief distorted his understanding. He was an honest man," Cecily said, "which is more than I can say for the signature on the transfer document." A pause. Portia's smile did not exactly vanish. It thinned, like ice in early March. "Edmund," Portia said carefully, "made certain decisions in the years of the succession that he has never fully examined. I assisted him in managing a complex estate transition. The specific paperwork involved was—" "You forged his signature," Cecily said. "That is a strong characterization of. You used the estate seal from your late husband's study. You intercepted the letter of credit that would have discharged Nathaniel's debt and destroyed it, or sold it, or redirected it. Nathaniel died because of what you did. My father spent 3 years being ground apart for trying to say so, and died believing he had accused the wrong man." She kept her voice level. It cost her something she would not name. "Tell me which part I have wrong." The door opened. Edmund stood in the doorway. He had come looking for her. She understood this in the way his gaze moved from her to Portia and then back, taking inventory. He had heard enough. Portia's composure fractured in the specific way of a person whose plan has worked for 4 years and is coming undone in a matter of minutes. She began to speak. Something about the protection of the estate, the necessity of the succession, the impracticality of Nathaniel's temperament, the realities of what Edmund would have inherited, had things gone differently. The words came faster than she normally permitted herself to speak, and they began to repeat. And then they stopped. Edmund crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped beside Cecily's chair. He did not look at Portia. He looked at Cecily, with a quality of attention she had not yet seen on his face. Not his usual precision, not his usual efficiency, but something that was working without a plan, and knew it. He turned to Portia then. "She is my wife, Portia," he said, "and you will leave Stancroft tonight." The words were not loud. They were simply done, the way a door is done when it is locked. Portia looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has finally encountered the limit of a space she had believed unlimited. She left the room without replying. Edmund stood for a moment in the silence she had vacated. Then he sat down across from Cecily, in the chair Portia had not used, and looked at her with his gray eyes, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became a different kind of thing. "How long have you known?" he asked. She thought about dissembling. She decided against it. "That you were innocent since this evening, that it was more complicated than I believed? For some weeks? And before that?" She met his gaze. "I came here to ruin you," she said. "I married you for a position from which to do it. I believed you had signed that transfer knowingly, and that you had allowed my father to be destroyed for trying to say so." He received this. He did not flinch from it, or soften it. "Your father," he said. "Walter Vane." "Yes." He was quiet again. "I knew the name. Greer mentioned him when I contacted him this week. I did not know the connection to you until this evening." A pause. "He was right about the transfer. He was only wrong about who signed it." "He knew that in the end," she said. "He left me a letter." "The one you opened tonight?" She looked at him. "You saw?" "The gallery." "Yes." He rose and moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment, and then turned. He tried to tell the truth, and was silenced for it. He was right about what happened to Nathaniel, and wrong only about the hand behind it. He paused. "I have lived for 4 years, knowing I inherited something I did not fully earn, in circumstances I did not fully understand. I believed Nathaniel's death was the result of his own improvidence and my uncle's negligence. I was wrong. I was simply wrong in a different direction than your father." Cecily stood. She did not know why, only that sitting felt wrong for this. "What will you do?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Restore what can be restored. Thomas is Nathaniel's son in my ward, and will have what is his when he comes of age. The Vane family." He stopped. "I understand there is no Vane family remaining." "Only me," she said. He absorbed this. "Then the Vane family is Stancroft's responsibility," he said, with a precision that managed not to be cold. "For whatever that is worth to you." She stood in the firelit room and looked at him, and thought about what her father had asked her to do in the last letter. "Open your eyes," he had said. She had been looking at Edmund Ashwell for 6 weeks through the lens of everything she had believed about him, and now she looked at him without it, and what she found was a man who was working without a plan, the same as she was, and was not running from that fact. "It is worth something," she said. "To me." The winter assembly continued without them for another 2 hours. They returned to it separately and properly, as befitted the Earl and his Countess, and no one who observed them for the remainder of the evening would have seen anything beyond the usual composed distance of a recently married couple managing a large public occasion. The distance, Cecily noticed, was somewhat smaller than it had been that morning. Thomas was waiting up when they returned to Stancroft, which his nurse had failed to prevent, and which Edmund addressed by the simple expedient of not addressing it at all, but simply accepting the child's presence in the entrance hall, with the resigned quality of a man who has begun to understand certain things are not worth resisting. He put one hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder and sent him back upstairs, and Thomas went, satisfied. The library was warm. Someone had made up the fire, though the house was mostly dark. Cecily and Edmund sat on opposite sides of the room and were quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable. She took the letter from her glove and set it on the table between them. It lay there, open now, her father's handwriting visible in the firelight. "He forgave you," she said. In the letter. "He said you were not the man he had described." Edmund looked at the letter. "He was more generous than the situation required. He was honest," she said. "Which is what he always was. It was what made him dangerous to Portia." He looked up from the letter and looked at her for a long moment, with the gray eyes she had studied for 6 weeks and was not finished with. "What did you come here for?" he said. "In the beginning. What did you imagine came after the ruin?" She considered the truth of this. "I had not thought that far," she said. "I believe I imagined justice was its own sufficient conclusion. And now, she said, "I think my father was wiser than I was. He spent 3 years in the wrong direction and lost everything. And in the end he knew it. He was asking me not to do the same." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "He might have sent you somewhere considerably safer than Stancroft." She almost smiled. "He was an optimist," she said. In the end. His hand moved across the table. Not toward the letter, toward her hand, which was resting near the letter. He stopped just short of it, the way a man stops when he has made a gesture he did not plan and is now deciding whether to complete it. She turned her hand over. An invitation so small as to be technically deniable. He covered it with his. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside the library windows, the frost had returned, silvering the kitchen garden and the folly and the hollow oak and the particular view from the east staircase landing. The house was quiet. Thomas was asleep. Portia was presumably en route to London, which was where she would remain until Edmund's solicitors had produced a document with rather different terms to her than those she had previously enjoyed. The letter lay on the table between them. Walter Vane's handwriting, patient and deliberate in spite of everything, had said what it needed to say. The seal, long since broken, lay beside it, a small curl of red wax that had kept it secret for 18 months and could now stop keeping it. The Earl of Stancroft had sold his soul for a title, or so the season had it. What he had actually done was inherit, in ignorance, a position shaped by someone else's treachery, and then spent 4 years managing it with a thoroughness that was the nearest thing he possessed to atonement, even though he had not known what he was atoning for. His countess had sold hers for revenge, or so she had believed. What she had actually done was carry her father's grief a little further than he had needed her to carry it, and then set it down in a library firelight in Hertfordshire, with a man whose hand was over hers, and whose profile was not, in this light, particularly like sealed wax at all. His thumb moved once against her knuckles. She did not look away. If you have stayed until the end of this, and I think you have, because you understand what has been waiting here, then you know what Cecily Vane came to understand in the library that night. The thing her father had always believed, before the grief narrowed him, was the truest thing he ever said. Worth survives being unseen. It survives, and it waits, and eventually, in some firelit room with the frost outside the glass and a child asleep upstairs, someone sees it. She was glad, in the end, that she had opened the letter. The fire burned lower. The letter remained on the table. His hand remained over hers. Outside the library windows the frost held all night, and in the morning it was gone. and the kitchen garden showed through the glass in the flat, clear light of a December day, the apple trees against the south wall, 3 varieties whose names she had been told and had kept, the grounds belonging entirely to themselves, as grounds do when the people inside have stopped requiring them to mean something and permitted them simply to be.